Hello, everybody. My name is Neil Foote, and we have this very special fireside chat today with Mimi Swartz, someone I know many of us have read over the years. And now here's our chance to get a chance to chat with Mimi. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me. It's delightful to be here.
Oh, absolutely. Well, for those of you, the few who may not know who Mimi is, she's a longtime executive editor at the Texas Monthly, a two-time National Magazine Award winner, and a four-time finalist. She's the co-author of a best-selling book, Power Failure, as well as a wonderful book, Ticker, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes. So Mimi, right before we got on, we were just chit-chatting about the year it's been. How are you? How have you survived the year? What's it been like? I was listening the other day to your bedtime story while I was working. So it's how are you, and how's the year been for you?
Well, I hate to say it. Our child is grown and has left, and my husband retired. So for us, being housebound wasn't that weird. I mean, I'm lucky we stayed healthy, and there was plenty to write about. So the main thing was I got a little bit out of the habit of it in person because we have Zoom and the phone. So I just kept working, and then in Texas, there's never a dearth of material. I mean, the year started basically with the freeze, and then things got even more interesting. So there was plenty to write about.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, everyone talked about last year being a news cycle where it just was nonstop, but it just kind of picked up where we left off. For you, you have a great position where you can kind of pick and choose some of the topics you write about. So what process did you use? I mean, how did you decide what you wanted to write about?
Well, I think, sometimes sort of like a stray cat, the topics pick you. I think, you couldn't ignore the freeze. You can't ignore what's going on in Austin. Usually a choice of eliminating things to write about instead of picking things. My husband has a saying, which is that you can't walk out your front door in Texas without tripping over a story idea. And I think he's right. I tend to balance my work between picking a really hard, exhausting story and then something fun. I just finished a story about a wonderful dancer who is also a TikTok sensation. And it's sort of like, those stories also, he is a Black kid, he's gay, he's sort of this moment. And I think all stories should be of this moment in some way and explain them. But that was a happy story as opposed to all of us freezing in our bedrooms in blankets. So.
Gosh, yeah. When we were the among the millions who had pipes burst, so we were dealing with renovation for a couple months after that.
Oh,
so
man. Yeah.
Yeah. So and we are among the many in our neighborhood who now have a generator because of that, right?
We got one before the freeze, so we were hosting many of our neighbors and their dogs and their children. So it was good. You kind of make lemonade, I think.
Absolutely. Which I think, which is an interesting thing in the conversations I've had with folks in recent weeks, is that folks have complained about the year it's been, but also this notion that, oh my gosh, I've actually talked to neighbors because we're out walking the dog or just outside, and oh, I didn't know I had a neighbor, right? So it's kind of that rediscovery in some ways.
Yeah, there were definite, I mean, I hate to say this, but there were definite upsides in the tragedy. So I do think, we all have to think about what divisions the pandemic in particular revealed about us. And especially in terms of the vaccination, well, now vaccination mandates, but how people responded to the shot. I think that's a sort of endless subject for us all.
Yeah, one of the conversations we've had with many of our panelists for this conference is this role of the journalist in chronicling what has gone on the past year, whether it's vaccines or a pandemic or politics, and you alluded to it already. This division, you've been at this a while. You've been a journalist. You've seen these stories come and go. And you've also been the brunt, I'm sure, of plenty of criticism about the role of media in either fomenting division or being the savior to help us carry us through. What are you thinking about? What's our role now? Has it changed over this past year? Talk about this, how you're viewing it now.
Well, I think things that strikes me is how much harder. I'm trying to think how to say this exactly. I'm going to use an example, but I think there's so many good journalists that I really admire, some of whom are more conservative than I think the average journalist. I'm thinking about Andrew Sullivan. I'm thinking about Emily Yaffe. Some people at the New York Times who have lost their jobs for basically or been driven out of their profession because of what they think. And that did not used to be the case. And I think that's disturbing. I mean, that's the role of Twitter. And I think, even this young ballet dancer I was writing about said to me, well, I'm a little afraid to talk because of social media. And I think that's had a very chilling effect on journalists and their subjects, because you think, well, am I going to get doxxed for saying what I believe? And I think that's a disturbing trend. And I think even in some stories I've written, there's been this thinking about, well, do we want to say it this way? Because we're going to get, the firestorms of hell visited upon us for saying it, even if we're correct. So I think that's been the most challenging thing.
And over the years, you've been writing about women's health rights and health, and particularly regarding abortion. And I mean, I found one of your columns from, I think, 15 years ago, when it was almost the same conversation. We thought it was the end of the world now. And I know recently you've written about it. How do you tackle these issues, again, knowing that the firestorm is out there, but also knowing that you have a role to play in kind of helping to vet some of these issues?
I guess so far, I've been lucky and I've been able to say kind of what I wanted to say and what the reporting bears out. I think, there are people out there now who don't want to hear what the reporting bears out. And I think we got to keep reporting the facts as we find them, which I've kept doing. And we're lucky at Texas Monthly, I think, that we have a terrific fact-checking department who really takes the story apart after it's so-called finished and makes sure we got things right, because you're going to make mistakes. And at least having that backup makes me more confident about what I say also. But I think you have to keep saying what you find to be the truth, or I have to keep saying what I find to be the truth, especially in the era of Trump and alternative facts.
Which is, I'm glad you talked about kind of this truth. And part of this other conversation is this both sidisms conversation is, how much, again, we're trained as journalists. It's like, well, Neil, you got to go out there and you got to get both sides of the story no matter what. And now we're in this very awkward situation where if we do both sides, then, do we fall victim to potentially spreading information that's not, true in this sense? How do you balance that with the idea of saying, well, for the truths we may have may be different for others, but then there's the facts, and what are the facts and who are the sources of the facts? Is it more complicated than it used to be, Mimi?
I don't think it is more complicated than it used to be. I mean, the job is the same. I grew up in the magazine world, not the newspaper world, and my mentor was the great Paul Burka, who used to say, you know, and my husband, who is also an editor, says this, you know, there's fairness and there's accuracy. And, you know, I think both sidism no longer serves us well. I think that's correct. Because you've got one side that does not tell the truth. And I've noticed in the New York Times, when they do go to the other side, they will say, you know, so-and-so says, you know, the sky is purple. But that is, you know, says incorrectly that the sky is purple. So they're on it. You know, they're following their obligation to call the other side, but they're also following their obligation to be correct and point out the errors when they're glaringly obvious. I mean, I think what's interesting is to look at something like the origins of the pandemic now, where at some point the so-called mainstream media was saying, well, of course it didn't come from a lab in China. And they were so determined that that was a Trump fallacy. Well, now we're finding out maybe it wasn't. So I think, you know, it really is, I guess, to answer your question, it's becoming clearer. It's becoming more difficult to clear your mind of your own prejudices and be sure that when you're giving weight to one side or the other, you aren't letting your own prejudices interfere. If that makes sense.
No, I think that's so important because I think that's, I agree that I think the fundamentals haven't changed. And I have this conversation with the students I teach as well. Journalism has changed, and even others who've been in the business a long time. Well, you know, everything's changed and it's not like it used to as well. But fundamentally, I still got to teach my students, you know, how to get this information, what questions they should ask, and most importantly, ask questions, right? Which is, I think, that's the scariest thing for me. Are we asking enough questions? And are we asking the follow-up question after we get some of this information?
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think there is. I mean, looking at the politics, you know, in some of the stories I'm reporting, it is interesting to see how many people are frightened in a way that I don't think they used to be. Maybe I was just younger, but I think in reporting on government right now, I think people are really afraid of retribution in a way that I don't remember happening, say, 20 years ago.
Yeah, and I think that's all around us as journalists and in sources, like you said, the young man that you interviewed. He wants to tell a story, but he knows if he tells his truth, there are going to be people who will, you know, attack him in some way. And it's like, okay,
he could lose 100,000 followers, you know. Like,
exactly, man. If I can get 1,000, I'll be good, you know.
I think it's like money. The more you have, the more you want to hang on to it. So
I think so. I guess that's the new driver for our generation. You mentioned your lifelong love of magazine journalism, and certainly the Texas Monthly is just one of those that's kind of stood the test of time. When where are we? I mean, is magazine journalism as important as it is now? Is long form? You know, this is the Mayborn Literary Nonfiction Conference, and we talk a lot about long form journalism. You've continued this passion about it. How does it fit into this world of someone who's just, you know, obsessed by 100,000 followers? Does it still have a place? What is that place? And what role does it need to play as time goes on?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I would say, you know, 2 or 3 years ago, I thought it didn't have a place because I think people thought we wouldn't. I'm looking for my phone. I think people thought no one would read long stories on their devices. But in fact, they do want to read long stories. So I think in a lot of ways, we can keep going. I mean, the magazines that are still in existence today, I think are still telling stories that matter. I think there were a lot of publications that in a funny way kind of deserve to die because they weren't being authoritative, and they weren't being responsible. They weren't being leaders. I mean, you look at the New Yorker today, New York Magazine today, they're right on top of the issues, and trying to explain them as clearly and as dramatically as possible, telling a good, and by dramatically, I don't mean negatively. I mean, they're thinking about how to use our many devices to tell a really good story. And when you tell a really good story, people don't care where they read it. I think I now read as much on my phone as I used to. I mean, I feel like a dinosaur every morning when I sit with my husband at the breakfast table with a real newspaper. But I think, what we have to do now is to fight and fight and fight to be relevant and fight to be trusted, because we are competing with a lot of kind of bad stuff.
Yeah, I love that, the idea of this fight that we need to have. And just the other day, I was listening to I was at a speech for Robert Deckard, once in the morning news, and he was talking about being with some of his colleagues on a fishing trip, and they talked about every morning going out to their doorstep and feeling like people were looking at them to say, well, what are they doing out there? Right, but I think that's
Absolutely.
kind of a tradition that still values, and I think this notion of the written word taking a different form, whether that's being read in print or online, is still a passion, and still a need. I think we've certainly seen with the conference and over the years of all the great authors and journalists doing work like you are, that there are people who love to do this, and better yet, students who still want to go into this business, which is just exciting to me, particularly for those who just are trying to figure it out and want to do better and are pushing themselves. We have so many authors in our audience as well, and you've had the pleasure to write several, a couple books, the Enron book from many years ago, and then most recently your book called Ticker, which is just a fascinating book. I kind of read some excerpts and listened to one of the presentations you did about it as you were trying to unpack how this story evolved. For those who aren't familiar with Ticker, tell us what the story is, how you kind of came about it, and then how does someone like you, who've written about some of the most popular culture and creative stories, get into a story that's so technical?
Stupidly, it would be my answer. It was interesting. I had been looking for another book to write and just couldn't find anything. This is advice to young writers, which is my advice is always go to lunch. I was working on another story, and it was a story about two artists who were marrying a tree, and because they were doing that, ran afoul of the gay rights movement. And so I was having lunch with another artist, and I really just thought, I don't want to go. I've done this reporting. I should just start writing. And the guy's name is Dario Robleto, who is a fantastic artist. And he turned out to be so smart. And he had just moved from San Antonio to Houston. So he had that beginner's mind about Houston. Everything was so exciting to him. And he started talking about Denton Cooley and Michael DeBakey, who, for people who were born more recently, were two of the most important surgeons of their time, being the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And he was so excited about them and what they'd done with heart transplants and heart disease. And then he started talking about another doctor named Bud Frazier, who was a protege of both of these men. And I was barely listening, because I thought, I know all about Cooley, I know all about DeBakey, and I knew Bud Frazier personally, and I had actually thought about writing about him because he's just a great character. He's a wonderful, wonderful doctor, and he's from West Texas, and he's a great storyteller, and he's just, he's the kind of person writers live to write about. And I was sitting there thinking, yeah, I thought about writing a book about Bud and his attempts to build the artificial heart, but that really wasn't that seemed more like a magazine story to me than a book. And then I suddenly, just sitting there listening to him, I thought, oh my God, this is a 50-year quest that started with DeBakey, if not before, and it's going on to the present day. And I started thinking, well, who wants to build an artificial heart? Why do they think that's a good idea? And then, like everyone else, you think, well, why should that be so hard? And so that was the question. I realized I had a book because I had this long span of time, and again, great characters, because books like TV shows hang on great characters and great personalities. And so then I realized, oh my God, I can write this 50-year story and find out why it was so hard. And that was the siren song, because then I noticed this, here's this behind me. It was so hard just to learn. You probably can't see this, how, I had to learn how the heart works. And, people spend their lives learning how the heart works. And so it was a little naive of me to think, oh, this won't be very hard, because all journalists, you're reinventing the wheel every time. So then I ended up having to learn not only that, but then the technological changes like magnetism, the tracks that Japanese trains run on that are powered by magnets are the same magnets that they're now using to try and make an artificial heart work. So the trick was to get all this technology in a compelling narrative. And it was difficult. And they still haven't done it. I think they're gonna do it this year. They've almost got a heart that works, but the reasons that they don't aren't just technological, they're political, they're sociological. It's a lot of reasons.
I think that's fascinating that for any journalist might have just passed on that story, but you leaned in and really tried to do your best to figure it out. Additional lessons to learn on how you learned about the heart. What did you do? Did you consult with other doctors, or you just read?
And I spent a whole lot of time with Dr. Fraser. And then there was a wonderful, wonderful woman who worked at the hospital where they were based, named Marianne Mallier, who was their medical editor. And Marianne's job was to take all of their papers and make, all their medical papers for journals and make them comprehensible. And so she became my very best friend, because it was kind of like with the Enron book, where I would call Sharon Watkins and say, I don't understand what a special purpose entity is. And I think I made that call 25 times. And it's the same with how the heart works. And she could explain it in a layperson's terms. So you always have to find, I think, Lawrence Wright, the great Pulitzer Prize winning writer, always says you have to find your donkeys, which is what he calls these sort of super sources that can carry a narrative. And I think, if Bud was my donkey, then Marianne was the person sort of walking alongside me, explaining why he was doing everything. You need two kinds of people, one to carry the narrative and one to help you understand your narrative.
Yeah, well, I thought it was fascinating because as I was reading and listening to your story about Houston, and even in your kind of personal life of your first job of working for that law firm. Summarizing these briefs. It as I was listening to you hear about Ticker, that's what it reminded me, is that's kind of where you had to go back to, is, oh my gosh, I thought I had moved on from this, but now I have these complicated cases. Now I have this complicated heart thing that I got to dissect and figure out how to summarize into words that everyone would understand.
No, I think that that's the journalist's job in a way, is taking really complicated things and trying to make them without losing the nuance and the complexity, making them understandable. You don't want to simplify them in a way that's false, but you want to simplify them in a way that's understandable, if that makes sense.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Now, I want to shift gears kind of back to some of you recently wrote about San Antonio in the recent issue, and this the opening of your piece here just is a wonderful scene setter, and kind of ties to some of the other work you've done in writing about you talk about writing. This was a very personal piece in many different ways, but it also really gave us a sense of the character of the city, the characters in your life and the people in life that help shape you, but also kind of where San Antonio is. Tell us about this column, but also this sense of, and George Getchow, the founder of the conference, always talks about place and how do you make place come alive. And I think you've done this in an interesting way that has you as the narrator, but you really take us on this journey.
Well, again, I think I owe a lot to all the people I worked with at Texas Monthly all this time, because our obligation was primarily place. I mean, we had to, your job one was explaining Texas. So every story had to have sort of, even if you're writing about the mayor of Houston, you have to explain, or think about and then explain, where is Houston now? How does this person fit into where we've been and where we're going? And that essay was actually, I credit my current editor, Dan Goodgame, because we're both around the same age, and both my parents have died in the last certainly decade. And so when I go home, home's not there anymore. Home exists in my memory. And Dan sort of said the same thing. You drive down the streets and you're in your mind, or with the person riding with you, you're saying, oh, that used to be so-and-so's house. That used to be where a great restaurant. And so I thought it was something I personally wanted to do, to explore the idea of going home when home's not really there anymore. And how do you sort of build another home and make peace with where you came from, and figure out how you want to make a place for yourself in this new place, if you do. So I enjoyed doing that piece, just wandering around, thinking about how, I hate to think about my age now, but, San Antonio has undergone enormous changes. And they're fascinating to me, because it was really, when I was a kid, it was so segregated and so small. It really was a backwater, and it's anything but now. So kind of figuring that out and looking at who's been able to move forward from my past and who hasn't, and why, is sort of, that was another really interesting question.
I love that frame of reference, because I grew up in Brooklyn in Bed-Stuy, and Bed-Stuy in the 60s was kind of the place that not to go. It was, and part of, whenever I speak to folks, I talk about the job interviews I would have, and I'd tell the people would ask me, well, where are you from? And they were like, well, how did you get out of there? Right. Yeah. And now, as I talk to my daughter who lives in the city, and my two sisters who's still there, and their niece, and they're still living in the neighborhood, and it's the hottest zip code in the country. And I'm like, so you've inspired me. Maybe that's what I need to do. I need to walk around and write that piece, because it's the same kind of feeling. And I do it with my daughter now. I'm like, well, yeah, that's where I went to school, but that's not the same school that it used to be. And I used to get the papers over here, and then we so I love that approach, which I think goes to you. Again, you alluded to this earlier on about where do you find stories, and in many cases they are all around us if we kind of keep our mind's eye open.
Well, that I have to say that is one of the most frustrating things. It was like that lunch when I got the idea for Ticker. I had spent 10 years sort of looking for the perfect book. And one could argue you don't need to spend 10 years, just find something. But when at that lunch, I knew immediately, oh, this is a book. And I went and wrote the proposal right away. And what drove me crazy is that had been under my nose all the time. And I think I have this horrible feeling there's something right now that I'm missing entirely. Because books are more like marriages. A magazine story, well, it's over in a period of time, and a book is a longer commitment. But if somebody could wave a magic wand and teach me how to find great book ideas that are under my nose, I'd be really grateful.
Well, if for those of you who are at the conference, if you have some tips for me, please inbox her, give her a call. Yeah, she's looking at that. Well, to talk about this, I want to wrap up and kind of what's next? What are you working on? What can you give us a sneak peek on?
State government. I think we're in a really interesting period. So I think there are characters there to profile. And I think that's probably, I think we all have to think about what are the most pressing issues in Texas now, and how do we tell those stories? And that's what I'm doing. You may be visiting me in an insane asylum this time next year. I don't know.
Well, let's hope not.
Yeah.
One of the questions that just kind of popped in my head as I was chatting with you is about voice, because so many people, when I said, "Hey, we got Mimi Swartz, she's going to chat with us," everyone has a famous story, a column that they've read. Do you feel like your voice has evolved over the years, or are there anchors to how you kind of keep your voice consistent? Talk a little bit about how you've kind of managed that over the years.
Well, voice changes depending on the kind of piece you're writing. Voice is much more important in like a San Antonio essay than if you're just doing a straightforward profile. And I think, if anything, over the years, I've had to mitigate just the wisecracks. I think if you grew up in the era of great magazine journalism, everybody was funny and voice was the most important thing. And I think over the years, I've had to realize, well, maybe voice isn't always the most important thing. You can get in your own way if you become too clever by half.
This has been a wonderful conversation. I know, as we said, there are a million things going on, and you just are trying to capture a couple of them in any given flow of the day. So we appreciate you joining us for the Maple and Literary Nonfiction Conference, and looking forward to keeping the conversation going, and looking forward to reading some more of your great work in the Texas Monthly, the magazine, or in texasmonthly.com, or however you may get your daily monthly long-form journalism. But I think we've heard it loud and clear. It's available, and there's some wonderful stories to be had, despite what everyone else may say, right? Yeah.
Well, thank you, and I hope you write that Bed-Stuy story. You should.
Yes, well, I may have to consult with you on getting some advice on how to capture memories that I think are don't seem important, but are those details that you are able to really capture in such a wonderful way.
Absolutely.
Well, listen, thanks again, and thanks for being part of the conference.
Thank you for having me. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Should I get off? Yes.